Welcome back to Talk ADHD, and this is all about something that anyone that lives with ADHD or lives with someone who has ADHD will likely be all too familiar with, and that's anger. The fact that for those of us with ADHD, getting angry and reacting to things in an angry way is all too common. Now, it's one of the most common internet searches in connection with ADHD. Why do I get so angry? Why do people with ADHD get so angry? And a quick search of the internet, if we ask that question, will throw up some things that talk predominantly about the traits or symptoms of ADHD that we're mostly familiar with. So things like emotional dysregulation or frustration or sensory overstimulation or social difficulties. But those don't tell us why we get angry. Those tell us what we are experiencing that can make us feel angry. So this episode is hopefully going to help us understand where this anger comes from, perhaps why as ADHDers we experience it differently, and then to give you some tools to help start recognizing it in a different way, to start understanding when anger might be building, and to try and do something about it before we inadvertently bite the heads off those we love or those we're working with, which in my experience tends to be the net result of frustration building up. So, Andrew, fair to say, anger's quite a common thing then for us ADHDers. Yeah?
Being human, yes. Yes, it is.
Yeah, right. And I think that's an important thing here. You know, everyone gets angry. ADHD, autistic, neurotypical, neurodivergent, everyone at some point gets angry. But what we tend to hear is, as ADHDers, or people who struggle maybe with emotional regulation challenges, that the way we experience anger is different. So I suppose the starting point for me would be to say, we talk about the brain, we talk about areas of the brain that are connected to ADHD a lot. Is there anything particularly that we know going on in our brains that is connected to anger? Or is there anywhere we could sort of look at on a diagram and go, it's that bit there that is at play?
Yeah, so it's a bit that sits just behind the bit that we usually talk about, called the amygdala, which is sort of the emotions center. It's the emotion processing, where the prefrontal cortex is about the rational thinking things through part.
Right. And is that a feature of our amygdala developing differently, working differently?
No, it's a feature of our frontal cortex working differently. So because that works differently, the brain compensates. So because the prefrontal cortex isn't doing what typically it does, the brain finds another way. It's a bit like, you hear about people who acquire a visual impairment and they talk about their hearing becoming more intense. That's because the brain is compensating, because that information's not coming, so we'll use the other information that's available, the other processing parts. So because we're not as good at the sort of the rational processing part, we fall back on the emotional response.
Right. Now that's an interesting start straight away. So just let me process that, and I think we'll talk about processing a lot today. Let me just figure that one out. So because we are not as adept at that skill of processing, of understanding the inputs, we are more want to more quickly respond emotionally.
I had an emotional reaction to what you just said, because that makes it sound like it's a choice. It's because I'm not thinking things through, I am going to be emotional. No, it's not like that. It's because that is not happening. This happens instead as a consequence, because I need to process what's happening in my environment.
Yeah, it's sort of instinctively, though. It's not it's just a something that
not a
that
choice.
Process happens for us. Yeah. Okay. So, the instant thing I'm thinking of is whenever we get angry, somebody says, "Calm down. Why are you angry?" Which tend to be the worst questions anyone could be asked at the point where we've just lost the plot. But
yeah, stop. Think about why. Of course, if you're having an emotional response and someone says, "Come on, think things through," and you're having that emotional response because you can't think things through, someone saying, "Stop and think things through," It's too late. You're already having that emotional state. It's happening.
Yeah. So I was just thinking, and I can't remember which of our episodes it was we spoke about, but way back when, and one of the first clips I think that we shared that people really latched onto from you was we were talking about this common experience of parents with children with ADHD, where the child goes to school, keeps their sort of stuff together all day, and then they come home and we see these really angry responses to seemingly trivial questions or demands, take your coat off or put your shoes away, right? And we get volatility. Now, you said way back when, look, that's a sign of how good your parenting is. You've created a safe space where the child feels that they're okay to do that. But if we park that, actually, is that at the core of what you were just talking about? If that child, and we'll come on to adults in a minute, if that child has been in school all day doing their very best to behave, to listen, to understand, and that's been bubbling away with the effort that takes, does it stand to reason that when they get home where they feel safe and they're asked to do something almost insignificant, that their response therefore may be completely opposed to what mom or dad might be expecting and might be angry because all of a sudden the pressure valve has gone?
Yeah, so the effort is in the regulation of that emotion at school. So all the effort goes in there, and that is so tiring. So when you get home safe, you just stop doing that. So there's even less prefrontal cortex activity. Therefore, there's more activity from the amygdala.
So now we're overstimulated and have nowhere to go with that overstimulation, and that response goes out somewhere.
Always there, but the effort that was going into regulating that with the resources that were operational in the prefrontal cortex. It's not like in ADHD there's no activity in the frontal cortex at all.
Mm.
But that processing power was being used to dampen down and regulate that emotion. Emotional dysregulation doesn't mean that there's no regulation of emotion. It's not black and white, but it takes effort. It takes processing power to deal with that. And then when you go to a safer environment, that you don't have to put that effort in anymore. And that's the compliment to the parenting, that actually it feels safe to not make that effort. Therefore, region of the brain that's been being regulated so heavily is now not. So of course that comes to the fore.
Does this also lead us on to talking about why transitions are A, so important, and B, so difficult? Because that's a conversation we've had before and I've heard before about our challenge with transitions from anything. And I was just thinking about this. When we go and we pick the kids up from school, if we're still picking them up, or even if they're walking home on their own, they don't have a lot of transition time. It's school's finished, now we're home, and now it's homework and it's after school and it's what. So typically, they don't have a lot of space to deal with that transition from one moment to another. And I can now kind of draw the line of, I can see why that would lead to becoming even more dysregulated and that being an angry moment. Because actually, when I'm mentoring adults, frequently I will hear adults tell me that, particularly if they drive, when they get home from work, if they're feeling dysregulated, that very often they'll sit in the car for 5 or 10 minutes before they get into the house just to calm down. Well, actually, replace calm down with managed transition, and they're doing it for themselves, but we don't do it for our kids as often. And that's, I think, a really important thing, because actually, if we can manage those transitions or help our kids manage those transitions, we start to help them manage that regulation of everything that's gone during the day.
Yeah. So this is something that isn't specific to ADHD, but it's heightened in ADHD. Think back to the early days of the lockdown in the pandemic, and people were working from home. And it was when we started doing this more, having more online conversations. People would set up back-to-back Zoom meetings, and we talked about Zoom fatigue. Yeah, it wasn't necessarily about the conversation part. It was the fact that we had 10 till 11, we had this person, and 11 to 12, we had this person, and there was no sort of 5 to 10 till 11, just, okay, let's just process that part before we go into that part. You know, so between meetings, having breaks between meetings is really, really important, because the human brain needs time to process what's happened and prepare for what's going to happen. That's not about ADHD, that's human. Once again, people with ADHD are the canaries in the coal mine a bit, that actually, because there are deficits in prefrontal cortex activity, we're more prone to express these challenges that are human challenges.
Is that really at the heart of this when we talk about these anger responses? What you just said, for me, is really crucial. We're more prone to expressing those challenges. So we may go to, not by choice, but, you know, we go from 0 to I'm overloaded quicker than perhaps someone else. Yet everyone else does have the Zoom fatigue or the meeting fatigue. And I talk about this in workplace training all the time. You know, right, we need that space. So if we're more prone to it and we know that, is there a conversation here about what is it we could be practicing or training ourselves to pay attention to differently that give us, I suppose the word is, early warning signs that we are becoming more dysregulated, maybe that the long fuse has been lit, and that at some point that will end up in a response that might not feel appropriate? Are there things that typically we might notice?
The challenging word in that is typically, isn't it? Because for everyone it's different, but we can learn about this. So the difficulty with anger is that it's quite vilified as a thing. It's not a desirable thing to be angry. However, the emotional state is desirable. It's like saying pain is not desirable, but ask anyone who can't feel pain how difficult their life is. So the emotional response is not the issue, but there are steps leading up to that emotional response that we can become more aware of, and we should definitely talk about those. But then there's the expression of that response as well. And often when people talk about anger, they're talking about how they express the emotion, not the emotion itself.
Yes.
Yeah. And that is key in this situation.
Okay. So let's break that down then. Let's start with maybe the why and then go on to the how we express, right? My interpretation of anger, rightly or wrongly, has always been that anger is a part of the sort of fight, flight, freeze, fawn response chain. It is information for the brain in the same way that fear is, and anxiety and excitement and everything else are important for us to notice. Now, we often hear analogies of, well, when we were caveman. So yes, I think is important. It tells us something about what's been going on, maybe where we are at the moment, right? But I understand that in this modern world, particularly, there's something I heard only recently last week, that we're so bombarded with stimulus that we're getting worse and worse at regulating our responses to emotions, whatever they are. And I can sort of understand that when we're bombarded by comments and opinions and social media and the news. But I suppose my question would be, like you just said, if anger is a natural, normal human response, is there a point where we say, okay, learning to pay attention to what anger feels like can actually help us in learning about how we may therefore respond to it, if we know what we're looking for? I mean, if we can distinguish between anger and fear or anxiety, for example.
So yes, emotions are a shortcut, aren't they? They're a broad brush to understanding, sort of broad brush response to our understanding of the situation we find ourselves in. Yeah. So, but they're not very nuanced. I feel angry doesn't really describe what's going on. It's a feeling that sets us in a particular frame of mind so that we can deal with the situation we're in, like other situations where we felt that way. So it's a state of mind in order to deal with where we're at, whether that's fear, anger, happiness, whatever. It's a framework of processing. But yeah, when I've been in arguments, when other people argue, and that the emotions are heightened, it's rare for someone to say, my anger leads me to think this very rational thought, and you don't reasoned argument in a heightened emotional state. It's not possible to.
I just was listening to you talking then and thinking, I can hear people maybe listening to this thinking, yes, but is that harder for ADHDers to do? To regulate that stuff, to manage that thought process, right? So no one's going to go, well, I'm going to have this rational thought because I'm angry. But, you know, the conversation we hear a lot is everything is so much harder if we have ADHD, right? Managing our emotions. We talk about emotional regulation. You know, we talk about RSD a lot, right? And RSD being a rejection response. But I know for me, there have been times where I could say, yeah, that was RSD, but it's led me to just be bloody livid, irrationally livid, just angry at the world. And it's only afterwards where I step back and go, I don't actually know what I'm angry about here. That's just risen because I felt that pang of rejection. Going backwards to what we said at the start, is that a feature of the way our ADHD brains and prefrontal cortex and everything are working differently?
It's everything I said at the start of the conversation. There's more activity in the amygdala than there is in the prefrontal cortex. If we focus on regulating down the activity in the amygdala, we're missing a trick. The way you've just described it is perfect. In the situation you just described, I'm in a heightened emotional state, and therefore I'm not processing rationally the information that I want to process. So am I going to focus on the amygdala being overactive, or am I going to recognize that the prefrontal cortex is being underactive at the moment? So yes, the thing that's making the noise is the amygdala. But the thing that I want to function is my prefrontal cortex. So why am I focusing on my amygdala? Yeah, that's half of the battle. The other half of the battle is saying, hang on a minute, my prefrontal cortex isn't processing information as quickly. My amygdala needs time to settle down, which it will do naturally. You know, you don't stay angry for years. Heightened state of emotion, you can have a rational sense of being disgruntled for years, but the emotional response of anger waxes and wanes depending on what's happening in the rational processing. So often the focus is let's calm down the emotional response, but actually there's another part to it, which is make room for that rational response. So the prefrontal cortex needs buffer time. It needs time to process, because then when that emotion settles down and the prefrontal cortex catches up with the environmental information, that's when you say, why did I behave like that? Because then the prefrontal cortex activity is caught up. You know, you shouldn't have said that.
Yeah, you know, I know we were speaking about this before, but that analogy of the being on a rubbish internet connection and trying to watch YouTube, where, you know, you get halfway through the video and the bar stops and the video stops and nothing happens, and you know, the impatience kicks in and you pause, press play, pause, waiting for something to happen. Then all of a sudden it skips about 3 minutes, and just for crying out loud. But then very quickly you're watching a video again and everything's okay because now everything's caught up. That as an analogy makes a lot of sense to me. And I suppose the question that I have, and I know as a parent and as a husband and other people may have, is, okay, experiencing that as another person, it's always, I think, easier to see when someone is looking like they're dysregulated, they're angry, they're shutting down for some reason, right? Or they're about to go. And yet it always seems to be the hardest thing to do as an individual. It's the hardest thing in those moments to sort of catch ourselves. And so I'm sat here thinking, when I mentor people, that's why I spend so much time on this concept of, very often, not all the time, but very often, that big emotional response, that flash of anger, as I call it, where did it come from? Are you really reacting to what's in front of you? Or are you reacting to a cumulative build-up, like we were saying before, of stuff that you just haven't had to deal with? Now, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because we spoke about kids at the start and the kid dealing with the stuff all day and then coming home. How many of us have been on our daily commute if we drive or ride or cycle or whatever, even pedestrians, and something has happened that's really rattled us, we've been cut up or someone's not stopped at a zebra crossing or whatever it may be, and it's made us furious with rage, I mean, properly angry, but because that part of our rational brain is still there, what we don't do is get out and go full road rage. We don't go out and start banging our fists on the car bonnet or yanking people off their bikes. We sort of internalize that. And then we get home and our partner says, how was your day? And the response is, wow, what happened there? Where'd that come from? Right? And I think that's important to remember is, for me, and what I hear a lot is when these anger responses are massive, unless we're very clear on why, when they're massive, massive responses, very often it's a cumulative buildup of more stuff. And it is just that we get to that point where our brains are overwhelmed, overloaded, and it's got to come out somewhere. And the greatest sort of oxymoron of this is, don't you always feel better after you've done that? The people in front of you don't. The people in front of you are left going, what the hell just happened? But we're there, and all of a sudden all the cortisol comes down, all the adrenaline reduces. I'm sorry. Right? That's the bit I think that's interesting is and that's why I say sit in the car when you get home from work if you can. Right? Take yourself off to a separate room when you get in from work. Just give yourself time to regulate, to process, to go, what's just happened? What's the day been? And remember that the people in your home or the people you're going to see next are not responsible for any of that. They are not connected to that crappy meeting or what your boss said or what that client said or your teacher said, right? I can sit here and say that and it seems so easy. And yet I can tell myself countless times where I've not been able to do that.
I need to stop you. I need to stop you because there's something really, really important in what you're saying, which is almost it sounds to me like you're saying, I can't regulate my emotions. And that's why this happens. However, if we go back to the beginning of your journey and that person cut you up and you don't go and smash their windscreen, that there is emotional regulation.
Oh, yeah.
This concept of emotional dysregulation, people with ADHD can't regulate their emotions, is such a binary statement, and that it's not true. It's another one of those grey areas that so often get overshadowed by the binary arguments that are made. We do regulate our emotions, and we've got limited resources to do it. So when we then come to somewhere that is safe, that's when the dysregulation kicks in.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't say that I can't. I would say that when I reach that point, I don't.
Yeah, there's definitely a tipping point. And after that, there's no amount of rational processing is going to deal with that explosion, that, we use the word meltdown. There's all sorts of language attached to it. But what often is missed is the build up to that, the understanding that yes, in that moment, the processing power of our brain just can't regulate the emotions anymore, and that's the bit that's missing. The anymore, that it's fatigue, it's a chronic build-up. Some of the things that are recommended for meditation is fantastic for this, but it isn't about that moment of Zen spirituality that is the function of emotion. It's the punctuation point. It's the allowing everything to slow down, calm down, to buffer, to process. We're really good at do now. That's ADHD. It's all now, and we need some nows that are empty, and that's what we're not good at taking. Empty now, because we feel like we're not doing enough. We should do more because we've got all these things that we haven't done.
Yeah,
so
I agree.
Adding in some emptiness is a really, really powerful way of managing the processing power that we have, that we use to regulate our emotions.
Folks, it's Matt, sorry to butt in, but please, would you do us a favour? We're a year old now, and we're really grateful for everyone that's been with us in this year, learning from us and sharing the information that Andrew and I have put out. but we need your help. So could you please like, share, and subscribe to the podcast and to the channel? We have big plans for 2025, and we need as many people to be able to see what we're doing. So if you can do those things for us and leave comments wherever you watch or listen, it really, really does help. For now, let's get back to the conversation. Yeah, absolutely. And, for me, one of the things I use myself and I recommend to all of the clients I mentor now who are struggling with this is that the pushback I get when I talk about mindfulness or meditation or anything, I don't have time. How am I going to meditate when I'm at work? Right? How am I going to do that? Okay. There are things we can do. I have a very good friend, one of my best friends, in fact, my son's auntie, who for years was a firefighter. Now, I know that she was trained, and I've seen other firefighters talk about this, has been trained. When they're in training and they're going to go into a burning building for the first time or a smoke-filled building for the first time, all the research and evidence says that will put them into a highly emotive state, whatever that may be, fear, anxiety. It may even make them angry because of what they've got to face, right? One of the tools they are taught, which we can all employ, is to do box breathing while they're putting on their gear before they get in, to do these slow, very conscious breaths, which doesn't mean lying down, going which doesn't need you to be in some Zen Buddhist retreat. Literally, it stood next to the fire engine whilst doing it to slow everything down, because the point is it gives them time to process what they're about to do and what they need to do. Everyone can breathe in for a count of 3, hold their breath for a count of 3, breathe out for a count of 3, and hold their breath for a count of 3, or 2, or 4, or whatever it works for you, dependent on your lung capacity. Everyone can do it. And I defy anyone to do that and not feel better, not feel different, right? The other thing I recommend constantly is this concept of tapping. Some people call it EFT, emotional freedom therapy, or tapping, and there are different variations. But tapping, for me, this kind of tapping on various points while talking through in my head the thing that's causing me the issue, or the thing that has caused me the issue, actually facing it, and then telling myself, but I don't need that feeling. I don't need that reaction. That as a process again, and I did this yesterday with a client for the first time, right? I'm yet to do it and see it not work. I'm yet to do it and see a 2-minute process not reduce someone's state or change their state. It's not about taking hours out of your day. It's not about interrupting things. Actually, I see it as a bit like a defibrillator. Right? We see defibs all over the place now, which are wonderful. Somebody has heart failure, a cardiac arrest, we can get a defib, boom, we can, reset their rhythm, right? Well, to me, tapping, box breathing, some kind of check-in is the defib for our emotional state when we're out and about, when we're at work. Because I know I can go and tap in the car, in a loo, in the office, right? I could do box breathing in front of people and them not know I was box breathing, but it will still calm me down. It will still work. And I think it's these concepts that, as ADHDers, what we're being presented, and you're right, we're being presented with a lot of the negative outcomes, right? And the challenges and the deficits. But what we need to be shown is we're just as capable, if in some ways not more capable, of employing tactics that can help us. We just need to recognize what they are and do them. Remember to do them. Now, I know as ADHDers, sometimes distraction is one of our sort of nemesis, but from the day I learned box breathing and the day I learned tapping, they are things I've never forgotten and I've not stopped. Because what do I know? I know that they've saved me more times than they've not now. They've made a difference. And I think that's important, because you're right, it's that ability to notice this state. But there is a question here, and you sort of touched upon it. Is anger useful?
Of course it is. So is sadness, so is pain. People describe these things as negative emotions because they're uncomfortable. That doesn't mean they don't have a function. That discomfort has a function. If you put your hand in a fire, it will hurt. Why is that? Because your whole biology says, get your hand out of that fire. Anger has a function, and it shouldn't be vilified. It should be managed, The responses should be managed, but it's telling us something. Otherwise, we make ourselves vulnerable to being abused and used.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important point, isn't it? As you say, it's vilified as a reaction. But what it does is gives us information. It tells us something about things that have happened or have been happening. And it gives us a moment to say, if that's how I'm beginning to feel, what do I need to do? And it might be, what do I need to do? Who do I need to speak to? What next? But it is so, so important to recognize it's not always negative. We're just told that it's inherently a negative and a bad thing to be angry, right? You know, you talk to people who suffer with alexithymia or alexithymia, however you want to pronounce it, you know, an inability to process or feel their emotions. That's like you say, that's like not being able to feel pain. That's hard. Not being able to respond to things in a way because your brain doesn't do that. That's really challenging. Feeling it, you're right, horribly uncomfortable. It can be embarrassing. It can make us feel small and insignificant and stupid and all manner of things. But if we can reframe it and go, but what did it tell me? Why did I get angry? Why has that caused that? And learn what we can do about it. We begin to build, like we've said before, the skills that support everything else that help us manage our ADHD in more useful ways. And I often think about my youngest son here, Dom, who's ADHD autistic, right? When he was little, boy, did he struggle with anger issues. He struggled, you know, we define them as big emotions. All these emotions were big, but anger was particularly one of them. And regularly, when he came home from school, he was so dysregulated that it was violent anger. And we're talking a 4, 5, and 6-year-old, but a kid that was, you know, full Tasmanian devil at times, right? And so what my wife did, which was scary for her because I wasn't around. And so it was often her and our oldest. But what she did that was brilliant was she gave him tools to regulate his anger. She never minimized it. She never told him stop being angry, but she helped him learn to regulate it in safe ways. Yes, sometimes that meant it was, right, go to your room and he'd throw things around and he'd shout and scream, right? Yes, sometimes he'd just go run rings around a garden. But what he learned was to manage it. And we now have an 18-year-old who actually doesn't get anywhere near as angry as he used to. And when he does, he's a lot better at regulating himself because he learned that earlier on. And I think that's the bit that is missing, particularly when we're late diagnosed. Right? We've been told to behave a certain way, to respond a certain way. Anger's bad. And when we suddenly realize, oh, wait a minute, hold on. It's the way my brain is wired to a degree, right? It's our acceptance of, right, how do I now choose to look at anger? How do I now choose? What tools can I learn and can I start implementing that help me manage those thoughts and feelings better so that the outcome is different?
Yeah. So there's something that's been buzzing round in my mind since you talked about box breathing that I have to talk about now, which is to speak to those people who you said say, I don't have time to do this. Yeah. For those people that don't have time to learn this skill, what will they see? If you don't do this, what will happen? What do they think zoning out is? One of the 9 core symptoms of inattention is the prefrontal cortex taking that time to process. If you don't do this, you will be more inattentive because you are using processing power. You're using that prefrontal cortex to process the emotions in the time where you're trying to focus on something else. There's no free lunches here. You've got so much processing power in the prefrontal cortex. You've got so much emotional capacity in the amygdala. And it's about managing that. Because if you don't manage it, the brain will manage it for you and you will zone out. You will be distracted by those internal thoughts that are saying you need to deal with that, the fact that someone cut you up on the way home. Yeah? So the brain will do it. What we're talking about is taking some control over that, rather than allowing the brain to grab a moment here or there where it can just when you need it to be doing something else. So you don't have time not to do this.
Absolutely. And I think that, yeah, I can agree.
If you don't give it, that time is taken from you and it's taken in a way that is inconvenient.
Every time, you're right.
And then we blame it on symptoms of ADHD.
Now, on that, do you think that's because that's the way ADHD is spoken about? That's why that's happening so often. We blame these things on the symptoms because this is the conflation between traits and symptoms again, between diagnosis and everyone does a bit of that. There's a lot of that we see online, isn't there? Right?
I think this podcast has taken us closest to this whole discussion about symptoms and what ADHD actually is. Because it isn't zoning out and it isn't emotional dysregulation. It's something about how our brains function. The emotional dysregulation is a postcard from that brain function. The zoning out is a postcard. But actually, we've come quite close today in talking about the relationship between all of these bits of the brain and the language that we use to send these postcards about what's happening in this complicated organic thing we call a brain, moving through a social experience.
Okay. If we've come close, what takes us a bit closer to then maybe this conversation taking briefly that direction it needs to take that helps people think of themselves and their ADHD differently. And I think you just hinted at it in terms of the way we're thinking, right? And all these things are postcards and all these things are sort of nods to the way our brain operates. When or how, therefore, do we get to a point where we stop viewing ADHD as the postcards, as a combination, a collection of postcards of negatives and of challenges, and rather as this is the way my brain works, and if I can learn to understand how and why my brain works like this, I can learn to live with it rather than fight against it. What does that take?
It takes stopping and taking time to reflect. It takes that buffering time. It takes that very thing that you said people come to you and say they don't have time to do. Take that time. Because in that time, you will understand the complexity of the relationships between all these different postcards and move beyond that medical reductionism of what it is to have ADHD to a personal understanding of what that is. And maybe anger gets the most attention because it's such an outwardly visible and distressing thing, because it is a negative emotion. You know, it isn't a negative emotion at all. It's a functional thing. You know, people don't say, what, you know, why do I, you know, one of mine was, why do I tear up when the opera starts?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I'm having this intense emotional reaction to being there in this sensory overwhelming situation, which is awesome. But I don't think about that. I think, why did I blow my stack in that, you know, and get road rage? Because it's not so bad to have these positive responses to emotionally nice things. We're always focusing on the problems, but actually all of this is part of having differences in sort of activity of different regions of the brain.
Yeah, I completely hear all of that. And, you know, from my point of view, when I'm working with people, I suppose I say a very similar thing now when I'm mentoring, when I'm working in businesses. This is a conversation about people, not the labels. We've said this so many times. The only person that needs to know what ADHD is the clinician that's diagnosing it and the person that's getting the diagnosis. And what does that mean for their ongoing care, treatment, etc. Right? That's it. The detail is for them. What we need to be able to understand for ourselves and to explain to others is, what does that mean to me? When I react like this, when I respond like this, what does that mean to me? What might I need that could help in that scenario? And how can someone else help us with that? Right? You don't need to educate them.
To them.
Say that again, sorry.
And how do I communicate that to them?
Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely. How do we do that so that they understand what that means and how to help? If we could have a culture and a conversation about ADHD and autism and every other neurodivergent condition that started like that, I genuinely believe there'd be less confusion. I genuinely believe there'd be less misinterpretation and fear and stigma, because we go back to talking about people, individuals, not labels and what people think those labels mean, right? And I do think there's an interesting point on that's why so many people with ADHD get so angry about the way others perceive ADHD. Because deep down, We're all individuals, and that makes us feel inherently misunderstood. I'm not the kid that ate the blue Smarties. I wasn't swinging off the lamppost. Well, actually, I was swinging off the lamppost. That was a bad analogy. But I mean, we weren't all swinging off the lampposts. But, you know, I'm not the stereotypes. Some of us aren't the stereotypes. The point being, we get angry. It's really good. This analogy is not working. The point being, we're not all those things, and yet we're told we're those things. And I understand why that makes us angry, right? Because it's frustrating. Because what do we want? We want to be understood and be able to say, actually, this is who I am. This is what it means. This is how I could be helped. Now, that's the same whether you've got ADHD, whether you are a wheelchair user, whether you've got multiple sclerosis, whether you've got dyslexia. It doesn't matter. You want people to understand you and your world as it means to you and how they can support you. But I think this conversation about ADHD and anger is important, because what we've touched upon is this, that yes, we know from the science, going back to that medical standpoint, we know because of research there are differences in the way different areas of our brains function and what that means. Okay, that's great. That knowledge is important. That medical understanding of why is important. But what's more important for us living with or living people with is to be able to understand, what does that mean? And how do I support myself and others support me in managing that, in being aware of that? And being told to calm down. Never really the best tactic when anyone's angry, let alone somebody that may be struggling to regulate themselves even more so at that time, right? Space, time, giving ourselves time to practice things that can help. Yes, these things fundamentally, categorically, will make a difference. They absolutely will. But it comes back to changing our opinion and our view of what anger means, what it's telling us, and what to do about it.
Yeah, the time to communicate that is not when you're angry.
No, it's not.
So take time. As you say, give yourself time. Whatever you need to do. There's 24 hours in the day. That's the time you get. How you use that is up to you.
Yeah.
And the pressure to do and be now, and that comes from years of living with ADHD and social expectations. But if you don't take the time, your prefrontal cortex will take it from you in moments that are less convenient. Definitely.
Without question, I'm sure anyone listening to this will be able to actually agree with that and go, well, I know that happened. You know, like you say, the shutdowns. I mean, interesting. The one thing I was just thinking, one of the most useful things for me that I've learned to do is through going into recovery from addiction. And I do this when I sponsor people now, is every day I try and do two things, whether it's in my head or written. I try and write down the things I'm grateful for in the morning, because it just sets me up in a more positive way. But at night, I write a list of all the things that I'm resentful of, if there are any, right? I write out these things that have pissed me off, that have made me angry, that have caused me those feelings. And I spend time thinking about why that's happened and who was involved. But more importantly, I also look at what my part in that was. How did I react? Why did I react that way? What could I have done differently? And doing that after the fact is so helpful, because it's that cold light of day moment to look at things and go, actually, when I wasn't able to process, when I was overwhelmed, that scenario felt very much like that. But as I sit here now, I can see it completely differently. And it gives me a chance that the next time something like that happens, I can make that choice to think differently, to choose to act differently, to do something differently. And it's not an instant thing, but all I know is it works.
Well, it works because you're giving some processing time to the prefrontal cortex to make sense of it. If you don't do that, then your emotional response is reinforced without any rational processing. So the rational processing goes quiet because the emotional state is so heightened. If then that voice of the rational processing never gets heard, then the monster of emotional response just grows and grows. And that shortcut, the next time you get angry, becomes even more heightened because it hasn't had time to get that balance between the two, between emotion and rational.
No.
This is the essence of cognitive behavioral therapy.
And, let's touch on that a minute. That's why, again, we see lots of studies and lots of evidence that says, in terms of those of us with ADHD, therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavior therapy are known to be really effective because they do exactly what you've said, right? They help us look at the thoughts. They help us look at the way we respond and process that in a calm state.
Yeah, that is what DBT is. What
Yeah.
is this emotion? Why is it happening? And how do I cope with it when it does?
Yeah.
DBT. It sounds fancy when you call it dialectical behavioral therapy, but that's it.
Yeah.
It is taking this time to do this.
And again, interestingly, how much time does it take for you to do that? Nowhere near as much as you are telling yourself it does when you say, I haven't got time. Nowhere near as much, right? But a lot of the time, and I know I've been guilty of this in the past, when I've said I haven't got time, it's because I know that doing that will be uncomfortable initially. Doing that may mean that I have to admit that the way I responded wasn't quite right and had consequence, right? And that's difficult and that's a challenge. But taking that step and doing that really does make a massive difference to being able to see it differently next time and go, I don't choose to do that. I don't need to do that because what I've got is evidence that says, if this, then that. Okay, well, let's not do that again. So you said this a few moments ago. This podcast is sort of, as we do, it's taken a sort of a turn to a different thing. How would you like to summarize this? How would you like to close off this podcast in terms of, we started on this concept of why anger. We've gone down a path of, hold on, this is more a function of how our brains operate, right? That then presents as these postcards. What's your final thoughts on it?
Okay, I'd like to go through the process of anger because I think that will help me pull together these ideas. As we go through our days, we are using our processing power, and the emotions are used as shortcuts to that. We become sort of overwhelmed, and the emotional state gets heightened. We are less likely to be rational. In that state, it's really important for those around us not to appeal to the rational processing because that's already drained. We need nurturing. We need to communicate to others that we are drained, that we are emotionally struggling. But that makes us vulnerable, and that's a very difficult thing to do. But we have a responsibility to communicate that. If that fails, we move into a state of heightened emotion where we can no longer regulate. That's part of, that is the emotional dysregulation. We've regulated, now we're dysregulated. At that point, the worst thing we can do is try and rationalize that. And the worst thing that people who care about us can do is try and encourage us to be rational. At that point, we need someone to be nurturing and say, it's okay that you're feeling like this will pass, and then we can talk about it. Stop trying to fix us in emotional dysregulation at that heightened emotional state. Give us room to let that dissipate. And then I think the last part is owning that. And your idea of sitting down at the end of the day and writing down all the things that you've pissed you off and reflecting on those and giving our rational mind some time to reflect on the irrational emotional responses through the day is like taking our rational mind to the gym and giving it the power that it didn't have in that moment of heightened emotional distress. And if we don't do that, then the emotional monster grows because it doesn't have the processing that underpins making sense of that emotion and making sense of, next time that happens, I don't want to respond like that. And it's a journey. So in the heat of the moment, the thing that I use most, and it makes me laugh every time, is when my emotions are so heightened, I stop. Hammer time. And every time it makes me laugh, and it just pops that bubble. Because then I'm thinking about MC Hammer doing his little crabby dance side to side. Yeah. And it just tickles me in that moment because that stop is so important.
Yeah.
as much as my rational mind can do at that point where I'm emotionally dysregulated, but it's enough to tickle me and say, okay, I'm going back. I'm just going to retreat. And then I'll come back to the situation with a calmer, more rational response. And I don't always do that. You know, sometimes it goes off the scale. But that's being human. It's okay to be angry. It's not great to express that in a challenging way, but it happens. And our responsibility as people is to learn how to manage that and understand the relationships between things like heightened emotion and processing time and all those sorts of things, and understand the relationships between these 18 symptoms of ADHD and how they interact with each other. Because that's ADHD. It's not the little postcard for little people in the mountains. There's a whole load of valleys in there that people don't look at as much as we probably should.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that description of there being lots of valleys that we don't want to look down as well, because that's where the discomfort is, and that's where we sometimes have to admit that we do have maybe some flaws that we could address, and there are things we could do differently. And it's that great word accountability, isn't it? Accountability is one of the hardest things I've ever had to learn for myself, but it's also one of the most useful, because it makes me look down those valleys. It makes me say, nah, you know what? I have a part in this. I have an ability to choose my response in this. So yeah, you're right. Right, folks, as ever, that's Andrew tackling a topic for us with ADHD in a way that I don't believe we'll see very many other places, if anywhere. And I've just gone along for a very interesting ride.
Couldn't do it without you.
I know, but self-deprecating. But listen, what I do want to say is this. If you are struggling with anger particularly, if you are struggling with your responses to things, please never be ashamed to ask for some help. Never feel like you can't say to someone, I am struggling, I need help. Because there are times where it's overwhelming. There are times where life is just too much. There are times where we just can't see the wood for the trees. And it's okay, no matter what age you are, to ask someone for some help. So find your tribe, find your people, find a space where you can say, I'm struggling. And even if it's just the validation of someone else saying, yes, I feel that too, because it can make a difference. Because the worst thing we can feel, particularly when we're late diagnosed and newly diagnosed, is alone in these experiences. And I promise you, you're not. We say it every time. We've still got the WhatsApp community that is, a couple of hundred people strong now, but it is one of the most joyously supportive communities I've ever been part of. The conversations Andrew and I see on there daily of other people with ADHD supporting other people with ADHD and validating things, it's just incredible. The link, as ever, is going to be in the show notes wherever you're watching this or listening to this. But please don't struggle alone if you're feeling this is a challenge, because there is help out there. You just need to know where to look for it. But other than that, we will see you again for another episode of Talk ADHD next week.
Bye-bye.